Hello. Just make sure that you guys are in the right room. This is the IW210 session, which is supposed to be tomorrow, I believe, but we brought it forward because of various disruptions and what have you. So we're going to talk about web content management. I'm Chan. Everyone calls me Chan, and I'm from New Zealand. So I made it here all the way from New Zealand. So it was a kind of a, I mean, I wanted to come to the conference, and Steve and I had chats. Steve was in New Zealand a few times over the last few years, and I actually happened to be in Paris when all of this ash cloud stuff happened. And so first thing I did was got a Eurostar ticket and came over here. So I managed to get here on Friday afternoon. So I was probably one of the lucky few who could get out of Paris at that time. So glad to be here. So I work for a company called Knowledge Q, and I also coordinate the New Zealand Sharepoint user groups. So we've got about quite a large number of people as part of the user groups. Anyone been to New Zealand? Yeah? Oh, quite a few. Cool. So we've got about 7 user groups in New Zealand in different cities and what have you. And we've got a good user base as well. I've been working in the SharePoint space for the last 6-7 years. Mostly come from IT Pro kind of background, and I do quite a bit of end user stuff, end user engagement kind of thing as well. So today we're going to looking at WCM and power users. What is this concept of a power user? I kind of like to use case studies and real world stuff when I present, so I'm actually going to use a customer of ours for this talk as an example of how you can use publishing technologies in the real world, because I want to keep it as close to real world as possible. What works, what doesn't, and so on and so forth, right? So funny thing happened yesterday. We were all rescheduling sessions and what have you. We were in the main battle room of the SharePoint Evolutions conference, and we had to update the session slides, update the sessions and the timings and what have you. So we were using some pretty old school technology, which was essentially Steve was sitting there talking to me saying, oh, you need to update this, and I was writing HTML. And then we actually used FTP to upload the layer session agenda. So, in the old school way, that's how we did things. You had like people creating the content, Word, Excel, or even on paper, write it, give it to a web guy, and that person would then format the HTML, create the HTML page, and FTP, or file transfer, or copy the file into a web server, and that was content management, yeah? But nowadays, it's a bit more complex than that. Obviously, you need to make sure that the content that you create is usable, it can be found, and it can be repurposed, all the sort of good things that then needs to happen as part of a content life cycle. So whether you're working like in the public service or in a private company, whatever you need to do with your content and how to get it published out to a site, there has to be some sort of a structured process. And therefore, you need systems that can cope with these kind of scenarios. So with the managing of the content lifecycle, products such as SharePoint help you with features to manage that lifecycle of the content, yeah? So when you talk about web content management, there's quite a bit of different things. It could be that you just want to publish out a page with names of the people that's going to come to the company barbecue. So you don't need to wait for a web guy to do that. You should be able to go in, type it in, and saying, these are the people who's going to come to the barbecue. Here's the place where you're going to have the barbecue. Hit publish. And for that, you could use the SharePoint Wiki or something like that, yeah? So that means that there's no much of approval or any kind of rigid control on how you do that. You could let anybody do that as long as they can actually get to that page or whatever that you're going to edit. And then you get the concept of an information portal where you actually need to publish some data or some content that needs to go through some sort of a structured process. Say, for example, you got a you have a sales division and then you want to display the last 5 days of sales figures. And if you had to go and wait through a process for that to happen, then the week is passed, therefore then you don't get anything done. So typically what you should happen is that you'd get your sales manager should be able to then create that piece of content, or if your system is smart enough, it should be able to get that data from the source and then publish it out, yeah? And then you got much more rigidly structured content that gets published in an intranet, for example, or an internet site, for example, where there's a bit more process and structure to how you publish that, right? So you need to have a bit more control, you need to apply branding, and therefore your content needs to go through a structured process. So today I'm probably going to touch more on that scenario to the right-hand side, on the corporate intranet and the internet kind of scenario, and what content management, web content management means in that area. So at a very basic level, the web content management scenario, the ABCs or the of web content management, which is basically authoring. You're authoring your content, whether in Microsoft Word or in a WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get HTML editor right on the page itself, and you don't have to think about writing HTML or anything. You just go to the page. Here's my page. I create it and I publish it. And then also you need to apply a bit of branding, because you need to be able to portray the corporate brand that your organization has got, so that you can't go and make your page pink, for example. It can only adhere to a certain color and so on and so forth. And then you got to put some controlled publishing processes around that. So for example, only Joe from marketing can talk about marketing, and Sam from HR can talk about HR policies and what have you. So to build a new website, what does it take to build a new website, for example? Yeah. So you need to have, sorry, I need to click. You need to have a customer who's the stakeholder, who's going to pay the bill to build a website. Sorry, my clicking is not working today. You got a project manager who would manage the project, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Then you get the IT guys who run around and put the servers and get the databases up and running, all that kind of stuff. You got a developer who'd come and code your website for you, and then you got a designer who would do the funky bits and pieces. But there's quite an important part. All of that stuff can happen, but there's quite a really important part, especially in content. After the website's been built, what's going to happen afterwards, right? All of that stuff can happen today, and then they go, here's your website, and if you hadn't thought about that person there, the content manager, and how that person would be actually using it, using your site, there's not much point in it, because you've now built a site, you haven't actually thought about the content management process. So with SharePoint, one of the things that I always say when you're deploying SharePoint, there's two phases to SharePoint. There's the phase that a typical Joe Bloggs would look at, that's your published content, and there's a page that your content authors are going to look at, right? So the view and the needs of those two are quite different. So if you're a content manager, or if you are working as a person in a web team who's looking after a website, you need to take the views of both those ways, because as a person, you're going to look at the published content. As a content author, now you're going to interact with the SharePoint's internals of how do you create a page, how do you apply styling, how do you apply branding, and so on and so forth, yeah? So web content management is not essentially a technology issue. What I mean by that is, if you hadn't thought about all the processes that needs to go with it, who's going to own it, who's going to look after content, who's going to review the content, who's actually going to be accountable if some content doesn't get reviewed, And it's also about people and their different needs and so forth. For HR, it's a different type of characteristics they want in their content. For a marketing department, it's something entirely different. So you need to kind of look at all those facets when you start talking about content management. So, a power user. I just came up with this because a power user is someone who has more than one job to do. Say, for example, in HR department, you've got an admin who might be creating content, right? But it's not just that job that they're doing. They're doing a whole lot of other stuff, right? And if you introduce a whole lot of complexity into your content management process, that person is not going to like you. So, because they've got other stuff to do. So all they want to do is just make it work. All I want to do is create this page and get it done. And a lot of the time when developers start creating websites, developers bring in their own little thing. Okay, we'll put a content query web part here, and we'll put a web part here, and a web part zone here, and all that sort of stuff. They don't understand that kind of stuff. All they want to do is go to a page, hit create, hit edit, and publish it, right? So you need to make it kind of simple. So essentially, I talked about that again. So users, we publish content, and users can also give feedback on content and so on and so forth as well. And power users typically go through that cycle. They gather content from other departments or other people. They create it, edit it, publish it, unpublish it, archive it for legal purposes and so forth. But they also have a day job to do apart from that stuff. And that's kind of right across the board. They're not just there for creating content. So therefore, when you actually look at your publishing processes, you need to make sure that it helps them, not hinder what they have to do, right? So I'm going to take an example of a customer of ours called Kiwibank. It's a New Zealand-owned and operated bank. It's quite a young bank to New Zealand standards. It was launched in 2002. Staff of about 1,000. There's a Porsche branch network, about 300 and 650,000 customers across New Zealand. Most of their technology functions are Microsoft-based, apart from some of their core banking stuff. Sharepoint is heavily used, first introduced by IT, but now it's been adopted by a lot of the other departments, business focus, so on and so forth. So there's plans underway to go to 2010, but this has been kind of a continuous work that's been going on for quite a while. So I'll also give you some example of at Kiwibank. SharePoint is kind of a large enterprise platform. They don't just use it for an intranet or a certain thing. They actually have a deployed platform where they can use it for many things. So they've got project sites, they've got collaboration sites, and also custom applications that they've built on it. And this is all on one single SharePoint platform. When I talk about that, what it means that it's got shared level agreements and then support level agreements with different business units on how their sites are managed and so forth. Yeah. So for example, for Adhoc collaboration, you could request a site. Everybody goes to a form, say, I want a site. It gets sent to via workflow, a site gets provisioned, and it says, okay, this site is only going to be available for you for 3 months, and after 3 months, this is going to get archived. So I need to kind of backtrack a little bit. You might think, well, how is that all going to work and so forth? So there's a lot of work involved in getting to this point to be able to be mature enough to do that kind of stuff. There's information architecture involved. Obviously, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about what you do with content, right? So I'm just going to set the scene of what we're doing. And they also have quite structured, process-driven stuff where you got project size. So for example, if Kiwibank is doing a project, typically IT projects or projects within the bank, they go to a projects portal, and it's quite structured on how they manage projects. So what they've done is basically they've taken their business process and applied it to SharePoint. They don't even call it SharePoint, they call it their projects portal. And they use that to manage their projects. And then a project site gives you all the things that you need to know if you're a part of the project team. You can see your KPI, your dashboard, and everything. So this project site was actually built, created to deliver the intranet, which I'll talk about. So the way they realize user adoption and how they manage this all is by ensuring that they've got a dedicated team to look after their SharePoint environment, and they engage with their end users and their stakeholders, getting feedback, and then also making sure that they apply it as they go. It's not just about putting a feedback form and then getting that feedback and saying, yeah, that's great, we got some feedback. It's about going back to the business and say, okay, you told us that we need this and this and this. How do we do this? So they actually continuously go talk to the customers and their customers, in sense, internal customers, and apply the things that people ask for. So while we were doing this, because they've launched in 2002, not much thought was put into internal processes and an intranet. They actually didn't have an intranet till February 2010. They had one, which was actually a front page site built by somebody with a whole lot of things in there, which wasn't being used as such. So we did a 3-month project essentially to build an intranet on their shared platform, which essentially meant they had all of SharePoint installed, configured, and everything, doing all the project sites, collaboration sites, and so forth, but they didn't have an intranet. So one of the latest projects that came on was the intranet. So when we started talking about the intranet project, there were a lot of other variables where they said, okay, we need to buy a new content management system, because they were not quite adverse to what SharePoint was capable of. So, but they settled on SharePoint because they realized, well, we already got SharePoint here in the bank. We already know what it can and can't do. Therefore, that's going to be the best option for us. So going from concept to reality, there was a lot of user and stakeholder engagement, meaning that we spoke to people who were going to be content managers, spoke to people who are going to be departmental leads who had accountability for creating content, and got all the information architecture done via a third party. Created personas. So personas is a way of saying, so I am so-and-so, I'm Joe, who's working at a teller, and I need to see this information. But at the same time, Joe could be a content author. So that's where I talk about there's 2 phases of SharePoint, where you are a user at one end and you are a content creator at one end. So we create personas for both to identify, as a content author, what functions do I need to do to get my content published. Created a lot of wireframes to go through the design. So the design you saw was broken down into structured wireframes so that you could identify which were the content areas, which were the editable areas, and so on and so forth. And a lot of training as well, so that people knew what they should be doing. So I talked about the operating model and role. So it is quite important that up front that you talk to users and say, you are a content author, here's what it is that you need to do, and also you need to get some executive champions and guidance so that people actually buy into that, so that they will start using what you built. So it's the publishing process that we came up for the bank, which kind of suited them, was based on site ownership. So site was basically, this is kind of the site map that we've got here. So that's the site map that you create as well before you actually even build anything, after you've done your information architecture and so on and so forth. You have an HR section, a how-to guide, which actually has some whole lot of structured content in there, and then about Kiwibank. So there's the top level site and a whole lot of landing pages. I'll show some screenshots as we go along, right? And then for each of these, we assigned content owners. So there are 85 trained content owners across the bank, and there are actually authors that sit below them as well. So a lot of effort went into making sure that people understood the importance of getting buy-in from the different levels, so that it can be, so that people were actually going to use this, and so forth. So to get a page published, so a content manager, caretaker of an area. So in SharePoint, you have sites, subsites, and subsize and so on and so forth. So we had content managers who will take care of and subsize. So the top level area, which is the home page, is quite dynamic. And then we have content author who directly authors the content. So for go live, the life cycle of content was because they didn't actually have, because they didn't have an intranet, they didn't have a concept of what content should go there. So there was a lot of work involved in getting content ready. So what we did was we identified content, submitted the content. So basically all this was done in using Word documents. QA'd the content, and at the same time, a parallel work stream started on training the 85 content authors and owners to get the content inputted. So once the website build was doing, the developers were doing their own thing, building this thing. And at the same time, what we did was around the training side of things, we actually got the content authors to start using the system to input the content. So therefore, by the time we were ready to publish, all of the content was actually in there during the training cycle. So we didn't lose much time doing that. Yeah. So, and then we came up with, okay, as business as usual. So once the site is launched, how does that work? So again, if you want to do a review, so we had a 3 or 6 month review for each piece of content. So you had a publishing date and a review date for each piece of content, so that that content would get refreshed, right? And so basically the process they came up with was they didn't want to complicate it too much. The 85 content authors will get documents which are formatted documents emailed through to the system into a SharePoint email-enabled document library. They'll pick it up from there, and they'll author that into the system by create page, and then QA and publish that. And then you have a review cycle of 3 to 6 months. So this is one of the landing pages on the HR section. So basically, E means that that content area is editable. A is aggregated content from below other levels, right? So it was quite important for them because they wanted to change the pictures and so forth, and they wanted to have the flexibility when when the template was built. From an editing point of view, we looked at it and said, okay, so in SharePoint you can have a master page which kind of does the branding for you, and then you have content placeholders, so field controls that allows you to specify where editable content comes from. And the areas marked with A is essentially content query web paths or data query web paths that will aggregate content from areas from other areas of the site. Yeah. So when you look at that in edit mode, so when a person goes to edit the piece of content, what we did was made it quite easy and simple. So we basically started putting in these, because it made it intuitive for people. As soon as they go into the edit mode, they could see, okay, if I go and edit piece of content here, I can say that it displays, when I put content over there, it's going to display in this area, right? So what we did was we enabled them, as soon as they go to edit mode, how that page would actually work in real world, right? So a lot of the time, these kind of things get missed out when you do web content management systems. It'll be just a whole lot of text fields, and then a person goes into the page and go, I don't know what to do with this. Then you have to go through a whole lot of training to get that person versed in how this page is actually going to be used. Yeah. So again, when you wanted to add metadata, so we added some fields so that you can actually make sure that they select the correct metadata fields, and you had some hints given to them as well. And one of the key things that we did was that there's always a review date and expiry date. And then we had mandatory content owner and page reviewer dates and so on and so forth as well. So we kind of made sure that as soon as person goes to the edit mode, that information was there, they could see it, they knew what to do. It didn't make their life harder by trying to figure out what's going on. So once you've done all of that, the other thing that we kind of used was things called reusable content. So for example, people wanted to insert tables and some special markup. What we did was in SharePoint 2007, there's a quite neat function called reusable content. So we created this reusable content blocks that people could use. So for example, if you wanted to insert like a table and the person didn't know how to write HTML, we already pre-created those tables with 3 or 4 columns, so they could just go insert reusable content with a specific styling, and then they could use it in that page. So that kind of thing kind of came in quite handy. This was basically done out of the box. And then a use of image galleries and so on and so forth, so that people could make sure that the images that were uploaded were in a specific site and they could use it right across the site. And they manage this process as a separate image. They've got a marketing department who looks after that area of the site, and they have access only to upload images that are specific to the bank in their corporate imagery and so on and so forth. So that area also has a different publishing mechanism and a process that allows only people who's got the approval to go and put images in there so that other people can use it. And then another thing we did was we actually used the wiki to help people understand how the content publishing process worked. So as soon as you go to edit mode, we had a link called CMS help, which went to this wiki to guide them through the process of creating a page. So if somebody came in and still didn't understand what was said in those yellow boxes there, they could go to the wiki and figure out, okay, now I know how to edit a page. So we kept that within there rather than taking them to somewhere else. And see, this is kind of like help saying, oh, I can't get rid of my bullets. What do I do? So on and so forth. So there was a lot of complex functionality built into the system, but it was easy for people to publish. So for example, this how to and policies area has a lot of these things which get, once you put a particular single piece of content, you could tag it in or apply metadata to it so that you can look at it in different dimensions or different ways. So for example, we have forms that go from A to Z, guides that go from A to Z. So there's a lot of developer work involved in getting that stuff done. But from an end user point of view, if I'm creating a page that needs to be a policy and also needs to go under forms, I could just click 2 buttons and then it will automatically appear there. So you hide that functionality and make it easier for people to publish into that area. That's the HR section, and that's kind of like a content page. And you also added these things called My Links and how to kind of customize their pages and so forth so they can get to the pages. So another area that quite popular with them was buy, sell, or exchange, which essentially was using out-of-the-box discussion boards. A lot of people go, oh, they don't work well. But if you kind of apply it in the correct context, they actually work quite well. So one of the areas that they quite heavily use is this area now at the moment, where they can actually go and buy and sell stuff, so within the bank. So it's quite helpful for employees and so on and so forth. And then another one was around searching for people. So SharePoint comes with a lot of really good functionality around people search and people data. So we integrated that and then allowed people to do keyword searches for people and find that information and then filter on that and so on and so forth. And then we had polls and event calendars and so on and so forth. So that area is essentially using the survey functionality that comes with SharePoint. And we just put a content query Webpart over top of that to get that functionality working. So as a user, if you were to refresh that, all you had to do was go to SharePoint, create a new survey, and then change a few parameters on that area, and then you have that poll going for a new survey, so on and so forth. And then we also created user help for example, navigating around the site for the end users, not for the content authors. And then this section called, which is essentially was My Links, which you could say that when you log on to the intranet, you had to customize links and so forth, created an easy way of for people to access their links and so on and so forth as well. So the special thing about this type of scenario is that you need to kind of engage with a lot of people to get to that level, especially for the content publishing process, because you are giving people the power as well as taking the power away from them to a certain degree, because they're only constrained into this area in a page with blocks to put in content. So you need to kind of make them comfortable enough that they don't get threatened by creating that. Like I said, a power user is somebody who's got other stuff to do. Therefore, when they go into that edit mode, they should be able to quite easily do what they were actually asked to do. So one of the things we kind of typically do is help the stakeholders also understand the complexities of managing content, because they also need to be accountable to make sure that this content gets published and so on and so forth. So how we did was to get 85 people across the bank, which is quite a challenging thing, was we asked from all the general managers to nominate people who would be the best people to be willing to participate in this as well. Because it's the worst thing you could do is suddenly say, here's the intranet, go and create pages in it, and you're going like, well, I've got a million things to do, I don't want to be creating pages. So if you engage with them early on and get them to nominate who the best people are, you're going to get better buy-in in terms of your content being refreshed and so forth. So we talked a whole lot about 2007 stuff. So 2010, a lot of the things that you saw is actually more improved in terms of content authoring. So you have the server ribbon. So if you go to some of the other sessions that are going to be on, you'll see how the interface is now much more like Microsoft Word 2007, for example, with the ribbon interface coming into play for SharePoint. And the publishing process, you have auto spell check and ways to check unpublished items. There were areas in SharePoint 2007 where you couldn't do some of these things. And then also one-click page authoring. For example, in a wiki, now there's a concept of who's used the SharePoint 2007 wikis here? Yeah? So it was quite difficult. Well, it was okay, but it wasn't good enough, right? So with now, you can just go to a wiki and just edit it straight away. You don't have to actually go to an edit mode. So a lot of the new technologies such as Ajax comes into play there, so that you can actually go to a page, click it, edit it, save it, and it's done. And there's another concept called the content organizer. There's better arranging of content. And one of the biggest improvements, I believe, is around the managed metadata. I think there's a session just after lunch in here, which was supposed to be tomorrow. Again, this was Reusable. Craig Carpenter is doing that session on managed metadata. It's a great session. You should go to that one if you want to know about that. I think that is going to be probably one of the best features of SharePoint 2010 coming forward. And then we also, in 2010, for content management, they've added social feedback with ratings. You know, when people give feedback, you can rate a page and so on and so forth. And based on that rating, you can bubble the page up or take it away or what have you. And a lot of improvements in the multilingual area as well. And another area is that also digital media. So if, for example, you wanted to add a video file directly into SharePoint, you can now have got a bunch of Webparts that you can add to your page to enable digital media right on your web page and so forth. So a few do's and don'ts. Like I said, provide explicit guidance. That means that make sure that when people go to edit mode, they are told what to do. Don't leave it for them to guess, oh, what do I put in this box that I see in front of me? Give them that guidance straight up front, because when you create pages in SharePoint in developer fashion, you can actually add those hooks into your page edit mode that allows people to know straight when they go to edit mode what to do. Right? Those yellow bits that I showed in my screenshots, it's so easy to implement. It's just another server tag that you apply. The only hard part is trying to get the business to come up with the right types of words to put on that and so forth. But it's still worth the effort because it makes that publishing process that much easier. Another thing that I say is provide a landing template for each area. One of the things a lot of the sites that I see do is try and be too clever by providing one template which fits all. So suddenly there you're stuck with this one template that does many things, and if you're not flexible in that area. SharePoint is a content management system. You can have as many templates as you want. Use it for that, right? Don't try to be too clever. And don't try to use SharePoint terminology when you talk to your content authors, because they would go, I don't want to learn that. Try and make it simple for them. When you go, like I said, it's going to be easy. Another thing that I say is you have your help link in SharePoint, and you send that. People, when they click on the help link, they go to the SharePoint default help link. That's not going to help people when they're trying to create content for your intranet or your internet site. So make sure that you use a wiki or something similar so that it's actually contextual to what they're doing when they're in help mode. In terms of workflow, so when you're doing publishing, there's a publishing workflow in SharePoint. A lot of the times what I see, people try to extend that to have 10 people and 15 people and so on and so forth, and nothing actually ever will get published because it's just in this loop. So make it simple. There's an author, there's a content owner and an author, and somebody who's in between, which is an editor who can actually create and publish stuff as well. So keep that into that 3-step, and whatever else you need to do that outside of SharePoint. Get all the images pre-processed, get all your content sorted out, and then apply what needs to get a page published into SharePoint. Yeah. Things like publishing reviews as well, because once the page's been built, that content has been published. Make sure that it gets reviewed again and again. How many want to go to New Zealand? Questions? I had to apologize. I had a demo prepared, but it just didn't work out for me because I was trying to get. I was going to show you the actual site, but for some reason or the other, it just refused to work, and I didn't put much time on it. Any questions? I'm happy to talk because we've got a few. Yeah, go on.
I think there can be a lot of confusion between if the server, Office server publishing feature is enabled or not.
Yes.
The behavior is totally different.
Absolutely.
Where I am, people tend to stick content editor Webparts on their pages.
Yes.
Should you allow that? Or
no. So basically, okay. So the question is, in SharePoint, there's a Webpart called the content editor Webpart, right? A lot of the times I say is you create a page which is a Webpart page, and people add a content editor Webpart to it. The downside of adding that is that you cannot version control a page, right? So one of the things that we didn't talk about was around version control of how many versions you keep and so on and so forth as well. So as part of your publishing process, you can decide how many versions you want to keep and how these versions are controlled. So when you enable, so in SharePoint, there's the publishing features that you enable. When you enable the publishing features, you get a bunch of rich controls which are called field controls that allow you to do a lot of the content management functionality. So once you add a content editor Webpart onto a page, the data that you put into that content editor Webpart is not persistent. That essentially means that once you created the page and saved the page, what you did previously is overwritten, so you can't actually version control it. So let me go back to yeah. So the way to do it is actually create a master page and a page layout with field controls in it, which you can then use to version control. So keep away from using the content editor Webparts. They are okay for like a ad hoc collaboration site and so forth, where you want to just say this site is used for so and so and stuff like that, but don't use it for web content management. That's probably not what it's meant for. And again, in 2010, there's lots of improvements in that area as well, around the versioning control and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Does that differ in 2010? Do you have the option of exploring the feature or not? Does the behavior of the...
So in 2010, there's the concept of enterprise wiki. So all of the so in 2007, you have the concept of once you enable the publishing features, you get a pages document library where all of your pages go to. So you have your URL/area/pages and then your page. So with 2010, it's a bit more different. Well, it's a bit different than that. Essentially, it's got a concept of a wiki page library. So, and you can do a lot of the functionality. And another improvement is around that is on the branding side of things. You know, you had two master pages that you had to deal with, and one of them wasn't that flexible in terms of bringing the branding across. But with 2010, you've got one master page that you can actually apply to the edit side of things as well as the user side of things. So there's a lot of improvements in that area as well. Yeah. Yeah, the application master. Yeah, so the application master. Yeah, there's still the two, but you can apply one to reflect across. Okay. Yeah, yeah. Yes.
One of the big challenges we have is building sites that are accessible, so standards compliant.
Yeah.
You can give a client the framework and the tools to do it, but they always copy and paste things in from Word or from other applications.
Yeah.
Which flows out of standards compliant.
Yeah.
How would you approach it? Like you talked about using placeholders.
Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, good question. So around the accessibility side of things, so for example, if you take a Word document, try and copy it from Word into SharePoint. So in this scenario, we actually used the Telerik editor for 2007. So Telerik does a good job of actually cleaning that out. In 2010, I've been told, I haven't tried it yet, that the editor actually does it by default, so that you can actually specify programmatically, or when you create the field control, to say strip it out of all the tags that needs and only apply source formatting for that specifically. So it's much more flexible. And there are actually third-party tools that would do that as well. If you want to build an accessible site, for example, then you can actually buy those third-party tools to do that. Yep. Any more questions? Yep.
Just as a quick question, we have a lot of problems with embedding links into text into a page, and then it can swap it out to a instead of a
Relative into a
relative,
yep.
it will swap it out to an absolute
Yeah.
path. I don't
Yeah.
know if it has been improved.
I'm not particularly sure. So the question is, when you create links within a SharePoint field, content editable page, if you put a relative link, it'll swap it into an absolute link. So in 2010, I'm not sure. I haven't tested it that level yet, because it's still been in the beta, and I've been working with it a little bit, but I haven't actually. So you can avoid that to some degree by using. So one of the things that happen is that, for example, if you use the content editor Webpart, that happens a lot of the time. But if you use a field control, the HTML placeholder field control will prevent that happening. So for example, in publishing, there's ways of getting content from one server to the other. So one of the things that I probably didn't talk about was around the content deployment side of things. So you've got an authoring server and you've got a publish server. So in an intranet scenario, typically you could go in directly to the server and then you go to edit mode, you can edit it, right? But in an internet scenario, you might have a authoring server and a publish server. So in that sense, it's the content deployment mechanism that takes care of it. So the scenario that you talk about is usually typically when you go from one to the other. And if the link doesn't get translated into a relative link, then you've got a broken link at the end of it. I'm not sure how it's going to be, how it's dealt in 2010, but I'm told that there's been lots of improvements in that area as well. Yeah. So before we go, I was going to just jump to that. So if you are going to visit New Zealand, come in June. We've got the conference happening. There's a few people from the UK coming over as well. Already we got some registrations there. So that's on the 9th and 10th of June in Wellington, New Zealand. Yeah. And any questions, please come and talk to me. Yep.
You said don't let content authors create sites. What is the
Yeah. So.
management structure that you can create sites?
Yeah. So as a power user, I mean, it depends on what they're comfortable with, right? So typically, when you've got a information architecture set up in an internet site or an intranet site, usually, if you're going to add another section, that becomes a site, right? That needs review. So therefore, you can have that. Obviously, it doesn't mean that the person shouldn't create it, but it should go through a proper review cycle that it should be created after due diligence of why that is needed and so forth. Yeah.
So you have like a panel.
Yeah. So you could have like a review panel. For example, the operating model will dictate, okay, so we've launched the intranet, it's 6 months, what can we do to improve it, right? What areas do we need? So actually I'll show you, so if I can just bring up my email, I'll quickly show you. We've just done because this was launched in where is it? KB. I'll just switch this email over to I'm just going to switch the presenter mode off. Yay, cool. So this is kind of like we monitored the so since the intranet was launched in February, and over the last kind of the few months, since launch in February, this is kind of the spike of usage. So this is quite important for the management team and also the caretakers of the intranet to figure out, okay, what do we do now with all of this data that we've got. So we are tracking essentially how many page visits they get and so on and so forth. So I just got this just before I left New Zealand. So this shows you how the visitors are spiking and what dates they're using and so on and so forth. And this data is quite valuable as a content author or a content manager or an intranet manager, so that you can now determine, okay, where should we put our focus on next for the intranet and so on and so forth, yeah? So it's a really good way of figuring out what do we do with it, yeah? So that's a whole lot of stats, and then we also use, I guess I didn't talk about the reporting that comes as part of Sharepoint 2007, which has been vastly improved in 2010 with a lot of analytics of how your pages are being used and so on and so forth. So it allows you to look at how your site is being used and then figure out which areas are we going to improve next. Yeah. So content management is actually part and parcel of all of those things. As a content author, you'd have access to these little things like, you know, page web parts and so on and so forth, but all of this stuff is actually going to help in maintaining that. Probably shouldn't be so.
So you're saying all your statistics are done using out-of-the-box tools?
We are doing a little bit more than that. But it is based on the out-of-the-box tools. What we've done is we've used a tool called IIS Log Parser, which allows us to create these graphs and so forth using Excel. So Log Parser gives you ability to actually query the IIS logs and then get the data that we need, which gives us a bit more detail. But we do look at search stats of what keywords people are searching, what they can't find, and then direct them. So in Sharepoint 2007, if you implemented search, you can use keyword best bets and so on and so forth to determine what things people are finding and what they're trying to find, where they're trying to go, and direct them to where they should be going. So all of those things are in play for the intranet and the other apps that's being used. Cool.
In your presentation, you were talking about content lifecycle, and you were talking about expiry of content.
Yes.
In that particular implementation, what did you mean by content expiry?
So in this particular implementation, it's mostly HTML, well, ASPX pages because that's what SharePoint creates. So it's a content page, right? So for example, it could be an HR policy or an IT policy and so on and so forth, which is essentially a page created in the intranet, which will have a expiry date set that it'll automatically, the way they wanted to do it was that every page that gets created will have an automatic 6-month expiry date set.
So when you say page, you mean in the pages library, so it's a publishing page?
Yes, as a publishing page. Yes, a publishing page. So so in the pages library, each publishing page that gets created throughout the intranet has a default 6-month expiry, but they can override it if they want to review that. For things like, for example, short announcements like this is what the social guys are doing and so on and so forth. Those have a shorter life cycle, obviously. But the default view they took was that we will keep anything corporate because from a corporate point of view, they have to keep it longer than 6 months, obviously. But we use 10 major versions of any particular document. But then we keep backups of that stuff for legal obligation purposes anyway, separately. But from a content management point of view, every time a person creates or edits a page, it'll go up to the version 10, and then it starts creating a new version. Yeah.
And in that implementation, was there any requirement for records management?
Not yet. There is a whole different work stream starting up around the records side of things, because, well, the financial sector in New Zealand is kind of twofold because it's not so the Treasury, the New Zealand Treasury has a kind of a view that any private bank has to keep their records for 7 years, and then so on and so forth. From a records management point of view for the bank, at the moment they're looking at how they've got a whole lot of file shares, as any company things do, but they're now trying to bring in better process management for their documents as well, which could be a while on how things go and so forth. But there was no particular records management requirements as part of this, no. But they do have so for example, when I showed you the project sites, each project site, after the project finishes, stays there. It doesn't get deleted at all because there's historical data in there that needs to stay. So what we do in the back end, if you're interested, is that we've got multiple content databases from a scalability point of view for SharePoint, and then we make sure that those are backed up and then archived away so that we can actually attach it back and give the person the site back if they wanted to.
So just one more question.
Yeah, it's fine. That's fine. Go for it.
For the content expiry, did you use the policy features?
No, we didn't. It was just we will probably be using policy features because they also use K2. So have you heard of K2? K2 as an application. So for some of the other applications using SharePoint, they use K2. We didn't implement K2 as part of this because we had a very short life cycle to get it from concept to reality. But there's a phase 2 that will start in actually using K2 so that some of the people in HR and so forth can create their own workflows and apply it to pages. And again, with 2010 coming, our thought was we are going to go to 2010. So with 2010 coming on board, 2010 has a concept of site-based workflow. So we can now decentralize that quite a bit as well. So our thought was try to keep it as much out of the box as possible, and then we'll move to 2010, then apply some of that more complex ones. But they do want to use K2 because K2 is being used right across the bank for a lot of things.
You made a distinction between personas and roles. I didn't quite understand.
Sorry. So personas is so if you so a persona is about a person who has to do some sort of a task, right? So that person may be sitting at the teller machine, right, looking at information that's been provided to them. So their job is to tell the customer these are today's bank rates and so on and so forth, right? But their role at that point in time is acting as a person at the teller. That's their role. But on the flip side, they may be the person who's also editing that page to apply the role, apply the rates and so forth, right? So in that scenario, their role changes. So your persona has a twofold make sense?
Okay.
Do you know what I mean? Yeah. So
Sort of categorization.
yeah, it is. Yeah. So if you can't remember the link, there's a good article. If I remember it, I'll put it on my blog around how you create personas and so forth. So it's basically user experience based design. Basically, what the user is doing. So you track the user's task and then create your wireframe based on that user's task, and then you walk through the wireframe with the user to figure out what the balance is, and then try and kind of find the sweet spot.
What do you mean by wireframe?
I'll show you a wireframe. Cool. Let me just exit out of this. I've got a million things in here. Where is one team? So we work with this company called Optimal Usability. So they do usability and information architecture for anything. Basically, they are quite agnostic of technology and so forth. So this is a very high-level wireframe. So for basically, so that's the home page, right? So that's the home page. And then if you look at what we built, let me just go back to. So if you do hopefully side by side, you'd see that it's quite true to the wireframe. Well, that's probably not a good way of showing it, but let's see if I can get that. So we go through that first before we touch any of that, so that we've got a representation of how visually that is. And then what we can also do is actually go into detail on, for example, how each of these areas function. For example, this area which is called alert, where does that come from? So when we go and talk to a developer, we can say that's how it's going to work, and then we can maybe break it down into another sub-wireframe which explains the functionality. So without creating functional specs, we can go with the wireframes, and then you can have annotations of this, how it's going to work, and that is going to be a SharePoint alert that gets generated, and then that is actually coming from a SharePoint list created in this area, and so on and so forth. So all of that was converted into sites, and then that was Webpart. So we could kind of visually look at it and go, before we built it, this is the components of the page, and so on and so forth. And then when you kind of go for trying to figure out as a content page. So for example, let me just quickly see if I can show one of the other wireframes that I've done before. Oh, sorry, I don't have that one, sorry. But yeah, but you get the idea. You can actually go quite into detail of how this all works before you even do any of the development work, so that it's actually quite clear. It's clear to the end user, clear to the customer, clear to the project manager, so you actually go through that scenario and then walk through that before you build it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is storyboarding, but yeah, we call it wireframes. Yeah. Yeah. But this company, they're pretty good. I mean, it saved us a lot of time of to and froing, because it was quite obvious as soon as you looked at the wireframe, you can go to detail and then say, okay, and when you do a side-by-side comparison, it's exactly what they asked for. So
the design company, did they supply you the CSS effectively?
yeah, well, we had to do quite a bit of CSS ourselves, but they did give us quite a bit of CSS. One of the funniest things that happened was, so you see that top navigation bar, home, HR, how to policies. So that top navigation bar, when we first got it from the company, was one single image layered with 3 gradients. So we kind of went back and said, well, in a content management scenario, if you do that, you're now dependent on the design company to give us another GIF or a JPEG or what have you for that top banner. So we went back and said, look, we talked to the customer obviously and said, look, can we actually make that text-based rather than, and they came back, oh, how are you going to get the pixels and so forth? I said, well, we can do that. So we went back to them. Those are the kind of things that you have to be quite aware of as well. If you, for example, implemented that as a one single image, if we were to add another section to the site, then there was a whole lot of rigging that needs to be done. But anyway, yeah, the view of that was at this point in time was easy for us to go and do that. Yeah. Cool. Cheers. Thanks for your time.